Hi KRB teachers, welcome to the final webinar in the Maximize Being the Best Version of Yourself webinar series. Today we are looking at respectful relations and how you can gain professional respect from parents. A reminder of the overview of the webinar series, and today we're looking at the third and final webinar and also third and final webinar in the module focusing on your relation with external people. If you haven't already, can I please ask that you scan the final QR code and answer some questions to help us gain an understanding of how your understanding has hopefully developed throughout the course of this webinar series, and provide any other further feedback that you may have for us. Starting with the introduction for today, what are we hopefully learning about? My aim today is to assist you with receiving respect from parents and managing challenging conversations with them. An overview of what today will look like is that we'll start with respectful relations and what is respect, the context and why is it important, return to remember your why, and I'll explain why that's important, and then look at some strategies in particular for gaining respect, trust, boundaries and communication, and finally the managing challenging conversations in particular for communicating with parents. So to begin with, respectful relations. What is respect? It's to consider worthy of high regard or to recognise the worth of a person or thing. So what is involved in gaining respect? Many things, but some of these include having approachability, understanding, recognition, courtesy, acceptance, and the three that we'll talk about specifically today is trust, boundaries, and communication. These three are ones that we're calling out as important in particular. Trust involves consistency and reliability, confidentiality and professionalism. Boundaries, clear expectations and setting those, collaborative goal setting and action plans. And communication is being proactive, being honest and transparent, and having genuine empathy and understanding. The benefits of respectful relations are obviously very vast and wide. From your perspective, you would be more appreciated if we gain respect. They help to improve student outcomes, and they also make for more comfortable and content parents, which of course is advantageous when dealing with challenging conversations that we'll talk about. So further context, you may recall we've looked at the Monash University research a few weeks ago, and there was a lot of feedback that was found in this study a few years ago that looked at the disrespect that is experienced for teachers from parents, to the point where there's things like abuse being reported, they're feeling demanding and overwhelmed, mental health is failing, there's a lot of complaining, they're asking constantly, to the point where teachers think, well, why do I bother? Unfortunately, in this research, 70% of teachers felt that the public does not respect them, which of course has huge implications for you yourself personally, as well as academically and professionally in the setting that you work in. Where does this disrespect come from? When teachers were asked whether they were respected by students, only 50% of teachers agreed. When asked whether teachers felt respected by parents, only 33% of the time they agreed. This continued to decrease with the media 17% and politicians 9%. So unfortunately what we can see is that teachers and yourselves are perhaps not feeling respected by the vast majority of the public, coming from parents, but even more so the media and politicians. This is why we want to focus particularly on how to gain respect, at least in the control that you have relating to parents, and how do we increase that 33% to much closer to 100%. We're going to go back to remembering your why, and I'll explain why this is important. So I do want you to recall just quickly, why did you become a teacher? And what is your why for being a teacher every day? there may have been some of these reasons that we looked at right at the start of the webinar series that I want to remind you about. It may have been your passion for education, making a difference, inspiring children, your love for young people, job satisfaction, the stability and security, the fact that you get to be engaged in lifelong learning, the social justice imperative or sense of community, which of course is hugely evident in KRB. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because there's two types of validation that we get from either ourselves, that's internal validation. So we obtain that from us within ourselves. On the other hand, external validation is obtaining validation from others. So one we get from ourselves and one we get from outside of ourselves, which is not where we can control. So internal validation is having a sense of self-worth, self-respect, self-esteem. External validation comes from places like parents, students, media, society. That's where we have just looked at when we're looking at where does respect come from. And unfortunately, because the external validation is not necessarily there currently, according to the research, it is more important to focus on your why to gain that self-respect and your internal validation. So when we derive respect from ourselves, it's far more powerful anyway in creating a sense of stability and security and sense of self as a teacher yourself, professionally, but also personally. And it's far more advantageous for not only yourself, but also to exert that sense of self-respect to others. And of course, when we respect ourselves and we have a high standard for ourselves, that's more likely to be reciprocated from the perspective of others. So I do want you to continue to remember and focus most importantly on remembering your why, because that is where the most important and the first place to get respect is from. So after we have gained respect from ourselves, there's other ways to gain respect from other people. And three that we looked at, of course, is trust, boundaries, and communication. So we're going to start with trust as a one element and way to gain respect. And this involves consistency and reliability as a teacher, maintaining confidentiality when speaking to parents, and also maintaining always professionalism. Gaining trust can be achieved by under-promising and over-delivering. And I think this is a really basic way to gain trust from parents, because you're setting expectations that are realistic in the first instance, and then you're sticking to what your word is and what you've said you'll do, and you'll actually overachieve that. So that's always a good way. So that's, for instance, saying something like, can we speak by the end of next week? And then scheduling a time, say on the Tuesday, for instance. So that's what I mean by under promising and over delivering. Gaining trust really comes from also doing the right thing. And integrity is doing the right thing, specifically when no one is watching, when you don't even have to. There's no necessarily congratulations or recognition or that external validation for having done so. I think that's a really important way to gain trust, is by having that sense of integrity, which is of course also in line with the Core Unum values and our Sacred Heart values that we have. Gaining trust from parents can also come from being consistent. So doing things in the same way so that they know what to expect of you. Being reliable, showing up to meetings on time, being professional at all times. That may be in line with your teaching standards, but also the how we at KRB conduct ourselves and what is that sense of professionalism that is expected of us. We mentioned under promising and over delivering, just doing the right thing, particularly when no one's looking or you're not getting necessarily that confirmation or validation from other people, and just practicing what you preach. So we'll ask that you bring out the worksheet from today and write down that one way you can gain trust from parents. As a second way to gain respect from parents is by, of course, setting boundaries. So boundaries are not necessarily there to enforce your own rules and dictate how you want to be. That's not just the way to think of boundaries. Boundaries really is about setting up a framework so that there are expectations that are clear and how to involve parents in interacting with you in a structured way. So that is another way to gain respect. This is about, of course, setting clear expectations, collaboratively goal setting with them, and also coming up with an action plan. The benefit of clear expectations means that it removes the guesswork. It creates a sense of comfort in parents knowing that you conduct yourself and handle yourself in a certain way, and how to engage with you takes away some of that uncertainty. And it also, of course, helps to improve your own work-life balance. As we've looked at with students, same thing with setting expectations with parents. It is a respectful and collaborative partnership between you and them. How can we do this? Similarly to students, communicating the outcomes and whatever that is that it's expected of them and how you choose to conduct yourself. Then collaboratively setting goals with them in line with those outcomes and frameworks you've set, and then sometimes breaking down into specific tasks or steps. So communicating the outcomes can be from a behavioural perspective in relation to, say, your dealings with them, but also with managing their children, is that these are the behaviours that are expected and this is what we act in accordance with. It also can be in terms of academics in relation to the student. So this is what you're having to teach to as a curriculum and a standard, and this is the goal that is anticipated for them in their academic lives. You can then collaboratively goal set with parents in relation to those frameworks. So you've already got the outcomes. Now it's like, how can we work together in using things like SMART goals, so specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, timely way. What goals can we set together as a parent and a teacher? You can also then break down specific tasks and steps, providing parents with homework to think about. So if there's something that you need them to do at home to help manage and to help facilitate the best possible outcomes from a behavioural and or academic standpoint for students. So giving them specific steps and tasks to work towards so that it is a joint effort. Like for students, some parents will refuse to engage, and the focus for you is to remember to focus on what is in your control. And you cannot, at the end of the day, control the actions and behaviours and choices of parents. You can only return and set your own boundaries and expectations. It's better to remind them that ultimately what they choose to do or not choose to do are their choices, and they're going to have long-term or short-term consequences for their children. So I think that helps to remind them that these are the boundaries. If you've set goals together, if you've worked together, it will more unlikely come to this, but this is always good to remember, is focus on what you can ultimately do, and you can provide parents with the tools to help themselves and their children, but ultimately it's up to them also to do the work. So grabbing your worksheet again, I would like you to write down one way, please, how you can set boundaries with parents. And thirdly, communication. Communication is, of course, also important in gaining respect. So being proactive with your communication, being honest and transparent in your dealings, and also having that empathy and understanding when dealing with parents. Communication, given the climate, is extremely important because of this world that we're entering into, which is not only in person now, but online, and the boundaries are becoming blurred. A lot of communication can get lost in translation. So over communicate and say it and say it and say it again. There is the theory that we do need to hear things at least 5 times in order to receive them. So even if it is in different ways, in different channels, you will at least have put out your expectations or your ways to communicate in a way that parents can then choose to opt in or not. But ultimately, at least you've done what you can to reach them or communicate in many and varied ways. So this may look like loading things on Aspire, considering something like we've looked at Class Dojo, where you can have individual but also class-wide updates, having Calendly, so they've got the option always to reach you in a structured way that's based on the boundaries you've set, and of course emails, and particularly having auto replies on emails, as we've looked at in a previous webinar, to set the way in which that you want to be communicated with. So how can you over communicate? It's being proactive, building that rapport and empathy and understanding with them to start with can really help to set up a positive and healthy relationship. Being honest and transparent are other ways that you can also do it. So in terms of managing challenging conversations, so when you do have, despite the communications that are over communicated, hopefully, how can you manage any of those difficult conversations that may come up with parents particularly? Would like you to take a moment to think about, how do you currently manage challenging conversations? This may be already some of the ways that we're going to talk about. So recommended from research and also my work as a psychologist. Most importantly is firstly to keep yourself calm, particularly when we have challenging conversations which can make you feel, quite nervous, that you feel like you've been attacked, is really to take a few deep breaths, which will help bring down your heart rate. Drinking a glass of water will bring down your temperature, which we know we do tend to get hotter as we get more revved up and angry. That's been found in research. And also not feeling like you have to respond immediately. Something I was taught early on as a psychologist was, don't let other people's emergency create a sense of urgency in you. So you can put some time between when you receive the attack or criticism or challenging thing that's been raised, and when you choose to respond. So just giving yourself a little bit of time to also reduce the emotion that can come, but also increase the use of your prefrontal cortex, which is where logic and reason, rational thinking sits. Secondly, try and keep them calm. And I'm saying try because this is, of course, not in your control. But what you can do is same sorts of things. Offer them a glass of water, validate their concerns. Often validation alone in the first instance is very helpful in order to acknowledge that you've heard what they're saying, speaking in a respectful tone and avoiding the tendency that we may sometimes have to be condescending. Being empathetic is exactly that way to respond in a way that really hears them, to validate them. So saying things like, I understand and hear your frustrations. You're not necessarily saying you agree with them, but at least that validation and recognition is there. And this is, of course, trying to see things from their perspective and understanding where they're coming from. This is, of course, the platinum rule that we're aware of, which is putting yourself in their shoes and seeing things from their perspective rather than thinking about how I would respond in their shoes. Also seeking common ground. It's great for teachers and parents, of course, to work together and problem solve together. That brings collaboration, and that way to do it is to move towards them and relate to them, finding the points of commonality, and ultimately reminding yourself and them that the shared interest is presumably the child or your student. And finally, thinking critically to problem solve together. It's that old saying, a problem shared is a problem solved, or a problem shared is a problem halved, whichever way you like to think of it, but using that opportunity to actually move towards them rather than away from, come up with a proactive and rational problem solving method together to then set up a plan that works ultimately for both parties. So to summarize some strategies for managing challenging conversations is, of course, keeping yourself calm, trying to keep them calm, being empathetic, that validation, and acknowledging that you feel their frustration, acknowledging that you hear their frustrations, you don't necessarily feel them, seeking common ground, thinking critically, and problem solving together. So finally, I will ask you to, again, bring out the worksheet for this week's webinar and write down one way you can manage challenging conversations with parents going forward. So to summarise today, I would ask again, if you haven't already, please do scan the QR code, given this is the final webinar and your final opportunity to provide some feedback and ask any other questions that you may have. I'll just give you a moment to do that, to scan that. And as you do that, I will go through what we hopefully learnt about today. Respect is to consider worthy of high regard. Respectful relations are important, given the fact that teachers do not feel respected by the public. Given that, and despite of that, most importantly is to remember your why, to seek and gain that internal validation and self-respect. Remember why you went into this in the first place. That is far more advantageous than seeking validation from external and uncontrollable sources, such as parents, the media, politicians, the public. When dealing with those, though, there are 3 different ways that we've covered today as to how you can gain respect. Firstly, trust, and that can be achieved by being consistent, reliable, professional, under-promising and over-delivering, and doing the right thing. Secondly, boundaries can be used to gain respect, and that involves setting clear expectations, collaboratively setting goals, breaking down the specific tasks and steps, and developing an action plan. Thirdly, communication and over-communicating is essential to gain respect, and that can be used by managing and making the most of multiple channels such as Aspire, Class Dojo, Calendly, email, any other ways you choose to communicate. And finally, managing challenging conversations involves keeping yourself calm, trying to keep them calm, being empathetic, seeking common ground, and thinking critically to problem solve together. Some resources, as always, your emergency contacts. You've got access to Maximinds, and you still do. If you want to use KRB 2024 for access, please do. And here are my contact details. If you have any other further questions or comments or thoughts, I'd love to hear from you. Thank you very much, KRB teachers, for another great webinar series, and I hope to see you all again soon.